Good morning and welcome to day two of our second annual Emerging Scholar Symposium. This symposium is a partnership between the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower libraries. Our theme for this year is Here is Your War, Military Press and Homefront Visions of War. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Tyler Bamford. Dr. Bamford has a Ph.D. in history from Temple University and was an inaugural Sherry and Alan Leventhal Research Fellow in the Institute for the Study of War at the National World War II Museum. Welcome, Dr. Bamford. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Troy. And thank you to the Eisenhower, Truman, and Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Libraries for inviting me to take part in the symposium today. In the summer of 1943, an American soldier on the island of Capri told war correspondent Ernie Pyle that, quote, "The Germans fight for glory, the British for their homes, and the Americans fight for souvenirs." Though this commonly repeated World War II phrase was certainly hyperbole, Pyle knew well that the unnamed GI had hit upon a key part of American soldiers' experience in the war. And as the foremost chronicler of the average soldier's views and actions, it was only fitting that Pyle turned to the topic of souvenirs on several occasions in his widely syndicated wartime columns. Indeed, just a few months earlier, Pyle recorded that on the day after the surrender of German forces in North Africa, at least half the Americans he saw had German souvenirs of some sort. With typically vivid detail, Pyle described how, quote, "Practically every American truck has a German or Italian helmet fastened to its radiator. Our motorcycles are decorated like a carnival, with French flags and the colorful little black and yellow death heads pennants the Germans use for marking their own minefields. Many soldiers have new Lugers in their holsters. Lots of our men clowningly wear German field caps. German goggles are frequently seen on American heads." Ever the GI's advocate, Pyle asserted that these spoils of war were completely legitimate and little enough recompense for soldiers' time in combat. Pyle was not the only American war correspondent to chronicle GI's seemingly ubiquitous desire for mementos. Indeed, most reporters who spent time on the front lines mentioned the phenomenon of soldiers' obsession with collecting and mailing home souvenirs in their dispatches. Whether it was tiny pieces of shrapnel, enemy uniforms, flags, helmets, swords, pistols, or even machine guns, American war correspondents in combat zones around the world regularly took a sympathetic tone when explaining the souvenir hunting phenomenon to American readers back home. The practice of gathering souvenirs and shipping them home, however, elicited mixed reactions on the home front. Although most souvenirs were harmless, many stateside reporters highlighted instances of dangerous souvenirs causing bodily harm or being used in criminal activities. The widespread concern these stories caused prompted the U.S. Army to publicize its attempts to crack down on the shipment of souvenir weapons in particular. The public dialogue between the military, news outlets, and lawmakers over the importance and potential dangers of souvenirs highlighted the role that war correspondents such as Ernie Pyle attempted to play as advocates for GIs to the American public. Just as a note of clarification, in this presentation, I will use the term war trophy to refer to pieces of captured enemy equipment and uniforms and weapons, and I will use the term souvenir to refer to any object that soldiers acquired while overseas, whether it was civilian or of military origin. News outlets and soldiers during the war often made no distinction between the terms and most commonly used the word souvenirs to describe the wide variety of items that soldiers saved during the war. Next slide, please. World War II was not the first war in which U.S. soldiers acquired large numbers of souvenirs. American servicemen since the Revolutionary War had scoured battlefields for war trophies and looted civilian property. During World War I, soldiers of the American Expeditionary Forces sought out war trophies on an enormous scale. And the slide shows two of those soldiers posing with their war trophies, German Iron Crosses on their jackets and German helmets on their heads. And this was a souvenir postcard that they sent home to their families. Doughboys' desire for mementos prompted them to comb battlefields, rob prisoners, and even trade with German soldiers after the armistice went into effect on November 11, 1918. As American units moved into Germany as part of the occupation force on the Rhine River around Koblenz, a burgeoning market in German army souvenirs developed. 3 months after hostilities ended, a German shopkeeper reported to an intelligence officer in the 42nd Infantry Division that she alone had, quote, sold more Iron Crosses to American soldiers than the Kaiser ever awarded to his subjects. Doughboys especially sought out helmets, bayonets, belt buckles, Iron Crosses, and trench art as their preferred souvenirs. The relatively short American combat experience in World War I meant that many soldiers acquired items after the fighting ended, with the aim of proving that they had contributed to Germany's defeat, whether or not that was actually the case. Americans' insatiable desire for souvenirs became so widely known that fictionalized accounts of it even appeared in foreign novels after World War I, including the 1931 sequel to Erich Maria Remarque's best-selling novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. Next slide, please. Despite Americans' well-known affinity for war trophies, when the United States entered World War II, its War Department had no regulations specifically governing the practice of souvenir hunting. From December 1941 through November of 1942, with the Allies' ultimate victory in doubt and comparatively small numbers of American soldiers actually engaged in ground combat with Axis forces, the issue attracted little attention. This began to change, however, in late 1942. American soldiers began acquiring souvenirs during the first Allied offensives in North Africa and on the island of Guadalcanal in 1942. The practice continued to grow exponentially after 1943, when the bulk of American ground forces undertook campaigns in Italy, France, and on the islands in the Southwest and Central Pacific. American GIs stationed overseas bought, looted, and picked up a wide variety of objects ranging from local handcrafted trinkets and antiques to enemy weapons, flags, and even human remains. Although the U.S. military officially held that its articles of war made all captured enemy material the property of the U.S. government, soldiers in both the Pacific and European theaters began acquiring large amounts of captured enemy equipment and mailing it home via Army post offices. The U.S. military initially took no real concrete steps to curb the practice, even as it discouraged soldiers from souvenir hunting in training lectures and literature, because doing so caused unnecessary casualties among American forces. Soldiers frequently exposed themselves to enemy fire while searching for keepsakes in combat zones, resulting in avoidable fatalities. Japanese soldiers also used war trophies to lure Americans into ambushes. In just one example from December 1944, Private First Class William Hesselbacher and a fellow paratrooper of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment carefully picked their way down a jungle trail on the island of Leyte in the Philippines to the spot where Hesselbacher had observed a Japanese samurai sword stuck in the ground about 100 yards from his company's position. Hesselbacher intended to retrieve the prized souvenir, which was flanked by the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers. As he approached the trophy, however, several concealed Japanese soldiers opened fire, mortally wounding him. The second soldier called for help, and Hesselbacher's platoon quickly raced to his aid. The first soldier to reach Hesselbacher, Private Lawrence Dubé, was fatally shot in the chest. The remainder of the platoon subsequently killed the Japanese soldiers and retrieved their comrades' bodies. Casualties such as this demonstrated soldiers' unwillingness to heed the ban on souvenirs. In spite of the War Department's efforts to discourage souvenir hunting, neither potential disciplinary action nor the threat of bodily injury dissuaded soldiers from frantically searching for souvenirs during World War II. In 1942, on the island of Guadalcanal, one Marine swam a crocodile-infested river in front of his company's lines in order to try and obtain a Japanese samurai sword. He was unsuccessful in finding any souvenirs, but fortunately survived the risky endeavor. Recognizing the popularity of souvenirs among U.S. soldiers, the War Department issued new regulations in July 1943 that allowed soldiers to mail home their personal property, legally purchased items, and captured war trophies to friends and family members. In reality, the new policy was simply an acknowledgement of the fact that soldiers stationed in war zones were already mailing home tens of thousands of packages every month that neither the War Department nor the U.S. Customs Service had the manpower to screen. Instead, military leaders hoped to restrict the shipment of dangerous objects such as explosives and ammunition, as well as appalling items such as human bones from entering the United States. The regulation mandated only that soldiers obtain certificates from their unit commander stating that the bearer was authorized to possess an object as personal property. The wording of the ordinance left it almost entirely to field officers' discretion to determine what constituted a legitimate war trophy, and many officers avoided restricting their soldiers' plundering of civilian homes and businesses. Some frontline officers did not want to prohibit souvenir hunting because they wanted to curry favor with their men. Quote, "The officer or non-commissioned officer bestrode a delicate fence on the question of looting," explained Sergeant Raymond Cantor. "By superior command, he was constrained to repress pillage, but the officer who followed every command to the letter soon found himself no longer in rapport with his men." These leaders could justify their laxity by reasoning that combat infantrymen endured some of the greatest dangers while receiving little added compensation. The result, according to Private Lester Atwell of the 87th Infantry Division, was that frequently, with a superior officer's connivance and signature, chests of silverware were sent home, silver dishes, banquet cloths, mother of pearl opera glasses, cameras, jewelry, ancient dress sabers, everything from paintings to thimbles. Other officers declined to forbid dubious war trophies because they themselves were avid souvenir hunters. Sergeant Ganter claimed that, quote, "the most ruthless, avaricious looters of all were officers." He attributed this to the greater opportunities rank afforded to loot on a grand scale quite beyond the humble GI. After the war ended, a War Department report concurred that there had been considerable confusion in interpreting the intent of War Department regulations, with the result that many items which are obviously loot and pillage have been certified as war trophies. I should also point out here that Americans were far from unique in their souvenir-taking habit. Soldiers from Great Britain, France, Germany, the Soviet Union, and Japan all sought out souvenirs, and many of their soldiers looted private property as well during the war. This situation led, on at least a few occasions, to American soldiers acquiring items as souvenirs that had previously been acquired by German soldiers during their invasion of the Soviet Union. Interestingly, soldiers from all armies grew enraged upon finding souvenirs among foreign soldiers whom they had captured, and in many instances, it led them to commit brutal acts of retribution against prisoners. And this slide shows a Life magazine spread from one of the Pacific campaigns, and American GIs showing off some of the items, including machine guns and swords that they had captured from the Japanese. Next slide, please. War correspondents in both Europe and the Pacific made no attempts to conceal the fact that American soldiers looted civilian property. Instead, correspondents described the items soldiers took from private homes and businesses in great detail and justified the behavior as soldiers' prerogative for risking their life on a daily basis. In the captured German city of Cologne in 1945, award-winning Life magazine photographer Margaret Burke-White photographed a squad of soldiers looting a warehouse full of wine, furs, and linens. She explained that she had, quote, "never read of a war in which soldiers didn't do some looting, and certainly this one was no exception." Burke-White speculated that some of the looting might be due to GI's curiosity about how their enemy lived, but she also reasoned that US soldiers had hazarded their lives every foot of the way from Omaha Beach, and now they wanted some tangible evidence of their success. Burke-White acquired for her own souvenir a giant Nazi flag on which she collected the signatures of friends and acquaintances. The thought of American men breaking into private homes and carrying off citizens' goods might have alarmed readers back home, but Burke-White thought it was only natural that a man who had been bombed, shot at, and sniped at is not likely to have a very high regard for enemy property rights, especially if he suspects the property has been stolen from others in the first place. Many GIs expressed these same arguments in their letters home. They were disgusted by the comfort in which they found Germans living, and rightly believed that it was the result of the Nazis plundering conquered lands. Moreover, most Americans entering Germany felt that it was one of the most beautiful countries that they had ever seen, and the thought that the Germans had been blessed with such beautiful land and still sought what belonged to their neighbors angered the GIs even more. Consequently, many US soldiers saw looting as a way of taking revenge on the citizens of nations responsible for starting the war. Ernie Pyle, shown here at left at one of his field writing desk in Italy, added his own commentary on how combat changed America's sons. In his column for the folks back home, Pyle gently explained how, quote, "our men have less regard for property than you have raised them to have, in part because the stress of war puts old virtues in a changed light. We shall have to relearn a simple fundamental or two when things get back to normal. But what's wrong with a small case of requisitioning when murder is the classic goal?" Acclaimed novelist turned war correspondent John Steinbeck put it more bluntly in his observations on the fighting in Italy. He wrote that among American soldiers, quote, was a kind of compulsion to steal, and German prisoners were frisked for watches, cameras, and sidearms with professional skill. Steinbeck joked that if the homes of America ever received the souvenirs that are being collected by our troops, there will be no room for living. But Steinbeck also made another interesting observation about why some soldiers collected as much as they did. In each case, he wrote, the collector has someone at home in mind when he makes the purchases. Grandma would love this Algerian shawl, and this Italian bayonet is just the thing to go over Uncle Charlie's fireplace, along with the French bayonet he brought home from the last war. Many family members wrote to their sons, nephews, and acquaintances overseas, imploring them to send home souvenirs, and the GIs felt that it was their familial obligation to fulfill these requests, and this only encouraged them to acquire souvenirs by any means possible. Not to mention that they also had seen the enemy equipment in movies and newsreels and posters, such as the War Department poster on the slide to the right, which gave them an idea of exactly what souvenirs they might attempt to acquire. Shipping the objects home was easier said than done in many instances, and Steinbeck noted that when combat soldiers got orders to move out with light combat equipment, they often had no choice but to abandon their collections and start all over where they stopped next. Combat infantrymen often had the greatest challenge in sending their loot home because they could not carry heavy objects for any length of time, nor did they have access to materials with which to package their loot for safe shipment home. Even for those who managed to mail their souvenirs, there was a substantial risk of theft or loss in transit. Despite the challenges, however, the soldiers often managed to send back multiple souvenirs per man. Many soldiers included notes in the packages that they sent home explaining that even if the objects inside appeared to be junk, they should not be thrown away, since they held deep personal significance to the soldier himself. Soldiers especially valued souvenirs from instances where they nearly escaped death, or items from enemy soldiers whom they had killed or captured. Because soldiers usually could not carry or obtain cameras to record their experiences, souvenirs served as key reminders of events or places that they had visited. Soldiers expected to prominently display these items after the war and use them to tell their stories to their families. Non-combatant soldiers who did not have dramatic stories to accompany their items would occasionally invent fantastic tales about their origins and the soldier's own battlefield bravery. Next slide, please. Some idea of the meaning soldiers attached to objects can be gleaned from the case of war correspondent Richard Tregaskis, shown here on the slide to the far left. He's the tall one. Tregaskis, who had reported on the U.S. invasion of Guadalcanal in 1942 before traveling to Italy to cover the Allied campaign to knock that country out of the war. In November of 1943, in the mountains near Corno, the 6'7" tall Tregaskis was wounded by German artillery fire. He received a serious head wound from shrapnel that perforated his helmet, and as a result of his wounds, could neither speak nor move his right arm. In spite of the severity of his wounds and the difficulty he had walking steadily, Tregaskis insisted on keeping his mangled helmet with him because he thought it would make a fine souvenir. As he made the tortuous walk to the rear, Tregaskis repeatedly picked up the helmet when it fell from his bandaged head. As he put it, he was determined to save it at all costs. Tregaskis recovered from his injury and managed to bring his helmet back to the United States. After his death in 1973, his widow later gave the helmet as a gift to a prominent lawyer. When the Postal Service was able to deliver soldiers' souvenirs to their homes in the United States, most families greeted the packages with excitement and proudly showed off their acquisitions to friends and neighbors. Souvenirs were displayed in storefront windows, at VFW halls, and at war bond rallies. One man even wore a Nazi soldier's uniform to a family picnic in a public park after his son in the army mailed it home from Europe. And the police were called, and it became quite an interesting family story. Another woman who received a giant Nazi banner in the mail from her son in Germany hung the flag outside the window of her Brooklyn apartment building to rid the fabric of its musty smell, and she quickly retrieved the flag, however, after her mortified daughter pointed out that it might attract the wrong kind of attention. Next slide, please. Although most Americans reacted to soldier souvenirs with fascination and delight, some objects elicited strong protests. In December 1945, the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin ran an article about a woman named Carolyn Massey, whose soldier husband had mailed her a silver serving set from the Nazi Party headquarters in Munich, Germany, that featured Hitler's personal monogram on the pieces. While the article called the Silver Service, quote, legitimate war trophies, a number of Americans felt it was inappropriate for soldiers to loot such valuable and prominent articles. The week after the story ran, Congressman H.V. Kaltenborn was addressing a large audience in Philadelphia when someone in the crowd asked whether a soldier would be allowed to keep a silver service he found in a private German home. When the congressman answered that certainly the soldier would not be able to keep such a valuable item, the audience member confronted the representative with the newspaper article. Other articles in 1944 and 1945 featured stories of soldiers sending the skulls or bones of enemy soldiers home as souvenirs, prompting widespread outcry. Life magazine ran the image of a soldier's girlfriend, seen here to the left, posing with a Japanese skull as its picture of the week on May 22nd, 1944. And President Roosevelt received a letter opener made from the bone of a deceased Japanese soldier as a gift in the mail. Although Roosevelt declined the gruesome offering, the story circulated widely, even receiving publicity in Japan during the war as an example of American barbarity. These were far from isolated examples, and a number of soldiers and Marines collected gold teeth and bones from the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers. Some Marines used the bones to fashion handles for their fighting knives and bayonets as well. Next slide, please. Even more alarming to the US military than these accounts was the growing number of domestic news stories that featured returning veterans and souvenir weapons being used in criminal activities or injuring civilians. In response, the War Department issued a series of revised circulars in 1945 and 1946 aimed at defining lawful war trophies and limiting the number and type of weapons that soldiers could mail or carry into the United States. On May 28, 1945, less than a month after Germany surrendered to the Allies, the War Department issued Circular 155 in anticipation of the avalanche of captured material that GIs in Europe would carry home following VE Day. This pamphlet forbids soldiers from carrying ammunition and automatic weapons into the United States, and it stated that mailing any weapons was strictly prohibited. The circular did not, however, place any limit on the number of weapons that soldiers could carry into the United States, as long as they possessed documentation from their commanding officer that proved the legality of their war trophies. Circular 155 effectively enabled U.S. officers and enlisted men to carry home as many rifles and pistols as they wished. American soldiers had already succeeded in illegally mailing untold numbers of pistols and rifles and submachine guns to the United States, but they now took advantage of the War Department's leniency to lawfully carry millions of firearms into the country. Second Lieutenant Spencer Wurst of the 82nd Airborne Division brought home 9 pistols, and he was far from the only soldier to return with a small arsenal. Private First Class James Madison of the 121st Infantry Regiment returned to the United States with 6 captured pistols. Even the celebrities and dignitaries who visited troops overseas wanted souvenirs of their own. Acclaimed actress and singer Marlene Dietrich, shown here on the left with a souvenir called a short snorter that was dollar bills or foreign currency taped together that had the signatures of famous people and soldiers that she met on her travels. She was carrying 10 enemy pistols when she returned to the United States in July 1945 after a 10-month tour performing for soldiers in Europe. That same month, Army inspectors counted approximately 35,000 foreign weapons in the possession of soldiers returning to the United States aboard just one transport ship. The large volume of untraceable weapons flowing into the United States greatly concerned Army leaders. The War Department possessed ample evidence of the potential dangers of its policy. In just 1 week, U.S. occupation forces in Germany lost 70 men killed and 500 wounded in mishandling German machine pistols, which had been seized as trophies. The number of fatalities could only be expected to grow when large numbers of captured weapons made their way into the hands of civilians. Still, the Army believed that banning all firearms as war trophies was impossible because, as one press release noted, quote, "The soldier, of course, is deeply resentful of any restrictions regarding his trophies of the fighting in which he risked his life." This statement accurately summed up the sentiments of most combat soldiers, but it overlooked the fact that the majority of servicemen overseas did not experience risk of bodily harm from enemy action because they served in rear areas. The War Department relied on the U.S. Bureau of Customs to implement the former's restrictions on war trophies. Yet the Bureau of Customs was woefully unequipped to enforce the military's edicts until the final months of the war. In April 1945, the Commissioner of Customs reported to the Provost Marshal General that on average, only about 4 to 5% of packages entering the country from overseas were being inspected. This total reflected the dire manpower shortage in the Bureau of Customs and the overwhelming amount of mail entering the country from the millions of servicemen stationed abroad. The Commissioner of Customs requested that 160 servicemen be assigned to help inspect packages, but the Army Service Forces Director of Personnel denied the Commissioner's request. When the Army finally did assign a limited number of soldiers to the Bureau of Customs to inspect packages at certain locations, their presence occasionally led to even more difficulties. On August 28, 1945, the newspaper, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, reported that 3 GIs working in a customs facility had been arrested for stealing items from servicemen's packages. As the number of illicit objects soldiers sent to the United States swelled, war trophies became a severe public relations problem for the U.S. Army. Across the country, newspapers carried stories about military weapons and explosives accidentally killing or injuring civilians. On July 21, 1945, the Washington Post featured a story from the Associated Press about a 16-year-old girl in Winona, Minnesota, who stabbed a 15-year-old boy to death with a commando-type blade brought home by the girl's brother, who was serving in the military. In Colorado, the Denver Post reported that a boy lost 3 fingers off his right hand when he touched off a dynamite cap with a match. Authorities later discovered that the youth possessed a variety of ammunition, including 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft shells that his brother had sent to him. Upon seeing this story, a number of the paper's readers came forward to turn in illegal souvenirs to the police. One woman turned in an anti-aircraft shell that her husband in the service had sent to her. Another family relinquished cyanide capsules that their son had captured and sent home from the Pacific Theater. In addition to incidents in which souvenirs harmed civilians, the U.S. Army noted an alarming increase in public attention being paid to crimes committed by veterans with souvenir weapons. In June 1945, 2 men in Philadelphia used a machine gun brought back from Italy to burglarize a cafe. That same month, an Army sergeant newly returned from overseas shot a police officer in Wyoming with a souvenir pistol that the soldier had reportedly captured from the Third Army when the Third Army liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Newspapers from Philadelphia to Los Angeles quoted law enforcement officials who feared the military weapons pouring into the country and who attributed an alleged uptick in crime to soldiers' war trophies. Many returning soldiers resented what they regarded as sensational media accounts that focused on crimes involving veterans. Soldier and cartoonist Bill Malden complained that, quote, every time an ex-soldier got himself in a jam, the fact that he was a vet was pointed out in the headline. An ordinary killing or assault seldom rated the front page, but if it involved a jealous veteran or a battle fatigue case, it could be sure of a prominent play. The ubiquity of these sensational stories even prompted the New York Times to publish an article in which Brigadier General Edward Betts, the Judge Advocate General of the United States forces in the European theater, in this article, he refuted the notion that the United States would experience a crime wave perpetrated by demobilized veterans. Betts reassured the newspaper that soldiers who returned to the United States would be, quote, more law-abiding than before they left home. Betts further claimed that U.S. forces in Europe enjoyed a low crime rate that any American city would be proud of. And he confidently asserted that once soldiers were again among friends and acquaintances, they would not dare do anything shameful in their sight. The U.S. Army attempted to counter reports of armed veterans and their dangerous weapons with articles about the military's efforts to crack down on contraband souvenirs. In April 1945, the War Department began funding the installation of several inspectoscopes, large X-ray machines designed to scan the contents of sealed packages at postal facilities across the country. By the summer of 1945, the government had installed inspectoscopes at the 5 points of entry for international mail: San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, St. Paul, and Seattle. Although inspectoscopes cost $4,250 each and required a crew of 8 men to operate, the machines quickly paid for themselves in the amount of government property recovered and illegal material seized. A wartime weekly news circular claimed that just one inspectoscope confiscated an average of $1,000 of stolen military property every week. On August 23, 1945, the Los Angeles Times reported that inspectoscopes had prevented more than 1,000 pounds of live ammunition from entering the country. The War Department simultaneously launched a public relations campaign of press releases and newsreels to inform civilians and service members about the inspectoscope. This campaign was meant to deter soldiers from mailing illegal materials and to reassure the public in response to the concerns voiced by law enforcement officials. An article in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer on September 19, 1945, began by asking, quote, "Are you waiting for that nifty Luger your soldier son took from an officer in Aachen? Or the latest model machine gun your uncle or brother picked up in Okinawa or Berlin? You can stop looking for it right now." Despite official warnings about the confiscation of dangerous souvenirs, in reality, the inspectoscopes could not scan all the packages entering the United States. The Army estimated that servicemen mailed home an average of 3.5 million packages per month in the final year of the war, and each inspectoscope could scan only about 60,000 packages per month. This discrepancy enabled soldiers to continue mailing home banned war trophies, dangerous materials, and expensive objects on which they should have paid import duties. In June 1945, Staff Sergeant James Reagan succeeded in mailing home a fully functional 20mm aircraft cannon, which he retrieved from a downed German fighter. Reagan mailed the disassembled weapon to his family in Brownfield, Texas, along with instructions for its reassembly. The Army was nevertheless encouraged by the success of the inspectoscopes and wished to further address civilians' misgivings about souvenir firearms entering the country. Both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the State Department had expressed concerns to the War Department over the possibility that large numbers of captured enemy weapons might fall into the wrong hands. Consequently, the War Department issued another circular on September 5, 1945, which permitted U.S. soldiers to bring only one enemy firearm into the United States per man. This new restriction substantially limited the number of souvenir weapons soldiers could legally carry into the United States. Next slide, please. Despite the Army's guarantee that soldiers could still bring home one souvenir weapon each, and that the Army had no interest in seizing legitimate war trophies, the restriction provoked outrage among many soldiers stationed overseas. On September 21, 1945, Captain William Ehrman of the 4th Armored Division wrote a long letter to his senators to express bitterness over the Army's newly established limitation of one firearm per man. Ehrman explained that the ruling has had quite a belligerent mental effect on practically everyone with whom I have talked. Ehrman proceeded to give a litany of reasons why soldiers should be allowed to keep their souvenir pistols. One of the most self-evident reasons to Ehrman and his fellow GIs was that many soldiers, quote, acquire pistols during combat and feel that they deserve the right to keep what should be rightfully theirs. He particularly resented the Army's order that excess pistols should be surrendered to authorities. Captain Ehrman correctly surmised that many of these pistols would then be distributed to rear echelon officers who had not had the opportunity to acquire pistols during the war. Ehrman vowed he would rather destroy his pistols with a sledgehammer rather than turn them over to those people after risking my neck getting them. But Ehrman also explained that the pistols were not only highly valued as personal souvenirs, but they also made excellent souvenirs and desirable gifts to take back to fathers, brothers, and friends, especially since there were few quality souvenirs for sale in Germany at the time. Unfortunately for Ehrman, his attempt to downplay the threat of souvenir weapons undermined his pleas. When he reminded his senator that after World War I, thousands of souvenir pistols appeared for sale in pawn shops across the country, Ehrman was describing the very situation the War Department hoped to avoid repeating. Many civilian and military leaders vividly remembered World War I veterans' bonus march on Washington, D.C. in 1932, and the accompanying fear that communist agitators manipulated the veterans in order to foment unrest. Policymakers worried that if another economic recession occurred again after World War II, as it had after World War I, growing numbers of veterans would resort to criminal activity. Sensational news reports about World War I veterans committing crimes in the 20s and 30s had stoked public anxiety that veterans would readily use their military training to become violent criminals. Even Ehrman's observation that the Army had already allowed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to carry home as many pistols as they wanted and mail home a large number of rifles only justified the War Department's new order. Ehrman saw the seizure of souvenir pistols as a blatant injustice to men who had to remain overseas longer, but his request for redress went unsatisfied. The Army issued its final regulation dealing with souvenirs from World War II in April 1946, and this document terminated soldiers' ability to bring any war trophies into the country after May 1st of that year. The circular made exceptions for soldiers to carry one pistol and one samurai sword into the country, provided that they also possessed a certificate signed by the commanding officer that stated the soldier was serving in the theater of operations prior to the cessation of hostilities. The War Department's decision to restrict the most sought-after souvenirs to only those soldiers who had actually contributed to the defeat of the Axis powers was a concession to civilian authorities pressuring the military to limit the flow of weapons into the country. Yet the regulations still privileged soldiers' rights to a souvenir weapon based on, quote, the theory that a trophy taken in battle may have special significance for the soldier who risked his life to take it. By the end of 1947, the Army had successfully discharged nearly all Americans who had served overseas during World War II and wished to return to civilian life. These soldiers' souvenirs, however, continued to pose a public relations problem for the U.S. Army when they periodically killed or maimed civilians. In the first 2 years following the end of the war, the U.S. Army made no efforts to address the issue of former service members' souvenirs. Lacking jurisdiction over civilian ownership of guns and explosives, the War Department initially left the issue of dangerous war trophies exclusively to civilian authorities. The Treasury Department's alcohol tax unit encouraged veterans to deactivate or register all automatic weapons in accordance with the National Firearms Act of 1934, but few soldiers did so because they would be required to pay a $200 fee if they sold or gave away a registered weapon. In order to reduce the threat of soldiers' souvenirs to public safety, in 1947, the Army, Air Force, Navy, National Rifle Association, and Treasury Department created a National War Trophy Safety Committee. This decentralized organization eventually grew to more than 20,000 people charged with making a coordinated drive to instruct military personnel and the public in the safe handling of explosive war trophies. Local committees acted as a collection point for the public to dispose of dangerous trophies and also offered to deactivate dangerous weapons and ordnance. By March 1949, the organization had deactivated nearly 750,000 shells, guns, bombs, and grenades, giving an indication of the staggering number of war trophies that entered American homes between 1945 and 1946. In the final analysis, the sensational image of war trophies as dangerous tools in the hands of veterans won out in the national media, despite war correspondents' efforts to portray souvenirs as a tangible reward for soldiers' wartime service. Although the U.S. military was generally unwilling to restrict all but the most dangerous and gruesome war trophies during the war in order to preserve soldiers' morale, the War Department quickly moved to limit the practice of soldiers bringing guns into the United States after the war once local news outlets began to give prominent space to incidents involving captured weapons. Former GIs resented the widespread characterization of veterans as dangerous, but in many cases, it seems they were anxious to put the war and their military service behind them, and so they often hid the trophies away in attics or dresser drawers. Their souvenirs, however, have remained important stores of memory, and their continued prominence in museums and as prized family heirlooms illustrates an important aspect of the experience of the American soldier in World War II. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very interesting and fascinating presentation. We are going to jump right into the question and answer portion. We have a question in the chat. And it says, was there any connection between souvenirs and black markets, domestic or foreign?
That's a great question, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today. There absolutely was, and souvenirs were often sold on the black market or purchased on the black market in places such as Italy. And war correspondents like Ernie Pyle and John Steinbeck, who were in that theater, noted that you could buy everything from food and gasoline to weapons and souvenirs and war trophies of any kind, whether they be helmets or German uniforms, on the black market. In the United States, I've seen less evidence, but it would not be at all surprising to see these weapons end up in circulation, being sold, among friends or families. There was also a major problem with theft among war trophies, which I think I touched on only briefly. So the souvenir flag, for instance, that Margaret Burke White brought home with her tried to bring home with her was actually stolen before she could get it home. And oftentimes soldiers, if they were injured and went to the hospital and had their souvenir pistols on them, if they were if they were unconscious or had to be put under for surgery, they'd wake up and find their souvenirs gone.
Okay. Our next question, it's a two-part question. So if you need me to repeat any part of it, let me know. The first part is, were there any institutions that GIs generally considered off limits for souvenir hunting? The second part is, were souvenirs taken from foreign museums, churches, and or concentration camps?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question as well. And the answer is nothing was sacred, unfortunately. So GIs would take souvenirs, even if they were, stationed in Great Britain, in a friendly country, and they were going to visit a cathedral or the ancient Roman baths, or sites like that. They would often pick up souvenirs, or like kind of chip them off of walls, with stones. So unfortunately, no. And this was even a bigger problem in Europe, in places like Italy, France, and Germany, where soldiers would walk off with statues or paintings from institutions, museums, castles, libraries, and as to the other issue of concentration camps, yes, those were also the site of souvenir hunting, which is extremely difficult and gruesome to think about. But some of the bones that they found in concentration camps were taken as souvenirs. There's in one memoir, a soldier mentions that at a concentration camp where the camp commandant's wife collected fragments of skin and preserved them, those allegedly were also taken as souvenirs by GIs. And although we most often think of body parts as being taken as souvenirs in the Pacific theater, there were rare instances, but documented in the European theater, of soldiers cutting body parts off of German soldiers as well. But very, very rare, much rarer, but not unheard of, unfortunately.
Wow. Before we ask the next question in the comments, I'm going to follow up with that, what you just said. I'm a little fascinated by this, about as a museum professional, as a human being.
Yeah.
Is it like just a respect issue, like a lack of respect issue, or is because I'm just cutting things out, cutting people's body parts, all of that stuff? Is it that people were just caught up in the fanfare? Like what?
That's perhaps one of the most difficult and yet perplexing and interesting, unfortunately, aspects of war trophies. So in the Pacific theater, it's been most commonly explained as the dehumanization of your enemy, and you no longer think of them as human, but rather as animals. So, and because of this particular brutality of that race war, in which very little quarter was given by either side, and soldiers would often find that Japanese had mutilated American soldiers' bodies, then it becomes somewhat more, I don't want to say understandable, because it's still not, but it's somewhat easier to comprehend how it could devolve into this episode where soldiers are prying teeth out of corpses, gold teeth, or mutilating Japanese corpses. In Europe, the war was less brutal, but there were instances in which German soldiers would capture American soldiers carrying a German pistol, for example, and then to send a message, they would mutilate them and disfigure them and leave them to be found by American soldiers. As a way, I think it was assumed generally that if you were carrying a souvenir, that it meant that you would kill the person that killed someone to get it. So it was kind of viewed as a sort of retribution or justice. There was also, when instances of brutality, such as the Malmedy massacre, in which German soldiers murdered in cold blood somewhere near 100 American soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge, that also provoked outrage among American soldiers, and they in turn would kill German prisoners of war in cold blood as well. And there's been a little bit more scholarship on this recently as well. So I would expect to see this issue continue to be explored. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll also elaborate a little bit more. I think in the Pacific too, there was going back to this idea that your enemy is no longer human. There's also a tradition of hunting trophies in the United States, and so this also could have had precedent when I talked about soldiers using bones to make bone-handled knives. Well, they had done so before with deer bones and things before the war. So this was not something that came out of nowhere either in culture, I think.
Okay. All right. Our next question from the chat says, considering the diversity of the items you mentioned, were there any types of items or materials that GIs avoided or refused to collect as souvenirs?
I can't think of any. And maybe that's a lack of imagination on my part, or the exceeding, it's easier to explain by the incredible diversity of souvenirs that GIs sought to bring home. In one instance, and then it's not just restricted as souvenirs to enemy equipment either, as I mentioned. In one instance, an American soldier tried to mail a Jeep home piece by piece. He was caught. I don't know whether it was the transmission that gave him away or the tires, but at some point, someone said, this is a lot of packages going to this address, I guess. So there was anything they could carry, was fair game. There's been alleged instances of soldiers, bringing home German motorcycles after the war. So I think basically the only limitations on it was the size. They took home things that were ancient artifacts. They took home medieval artifacts, whether it's swords, helmets, armor, firearms from every era, explosives, as it turns out, and of course antiquities such as and paintings and sculptures. One Roman sculpture actually just turned up recently in Texas, and it was in the news, and it was a Roman bust, and it had been looted during the war from a German museum. And that's not uncommon. I'm not singling out Texas, of course, but these kind of things continue to appear all over the world. And it was the reason why the U.S. Army created the Monuments Men, which have, because of the major motion picture, are more famous. But those men were that unit of specialists, art historians and archaeologists, was designed to protect the antiquities of Europe and especially buildings, not just from American artillery fire or bombs, but also from American soldiers, which is part of this story of souvenirs too.
So I want to follow up on a few things that you said. So from a museum perspective, a museum professional perspective, firstly, like the bus that just showed up in Texas, are we finding more and more of these war trophies are starting to pop up as people are dying out and their children and are going through their things? Are we finding more and more of these trophies turning up?
Yeah, I think we are. I think that's part of it, is that as families downsize and as these veterans sadly pass away, their artifacts and trophies are coming to light. I was at the privilege to be at the World War II Museum, as you mentioned, for a year and a half, and that museum, regularly receives solicitations or requests, asking them, would you accept these artifacts? And so they unfortunately have to be rather selective because there's so many things that people save. Speaking of museum professionals, though, I do not know of any museums that accept human remains as souvenirs, and this is morally that makes perfect sense. And a lot of these remains were later repatriated to Japan for proper burial. But it also means that we might lose a part of that story too. And so it's important to document it. And for good reason that human remains are not displayed. It's a very morbid thing. But so yeah, I think we will continue to see more. There's still great works of art that were lost during World War II and other things that hopefully resurface. Hopefully they weren't destroyed. The Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, its soldiers and its government carried away immense amounts of treasure and cultural artifacts back to Russia and Soviet Union after the war as well, and so as war trophies. And so hopefully those will resurface one day as well. So it's a global, just like the art market is a global market. That these can surface anywhere at any time.
Okay, and then I want to follow up too with the idea of repatriation, because we know that's a big thing, right? And
Mhm.
From the museum perspective, what you mostly see are things that are in museum collections already
Mhm.
that, they're starting to realize, okay, this needs to go back to their home country or whatever.
Yeah.
But is there an effort for these individually owned war trophies? Is there an effort out there to start trying to get those repatriated, like to encourage people to turn them in and get them repatriated?
There, I think it's very much on an individual case by case basis. Some people, when they find these artifacts, they want to do the right thing and return them. With the case in Texas, as it turns out, that's not always very straightforward as you might hope it would be, and it sometimes involves lawyers getting involved. And to, I guess, to iron out the terms of the repatriation, soldiers. I think family members, there's some family members who might wish to keep things in their families, and these become a part of family lore. So it's not a guarantee that eventually everything will come out. Although we've certainly have been seeing some prominent things surface lately. It's also the entire fine art market is still in turmoil because of what happened during World War II in Europe, where Germany and then also Japan, systematically stole large amounts of artwork. And so it's incredibly important to have provenance on a piece before 1933, honestly, because during the 1930s, when Jewish families especially were forced to sell artwork under duress, and the issue of whether these sales were legitimate, and oftentimes they're ruled they were not, and that the families do have a claim that can spawn, rightfully so, court cases that go on, and it's often very difficult for these families to prove that they did own artwork. And so those that can have a much better shot, but who keeps pictures of something that their family owned 100 years ago now, or 80 years ago?
Right. And
Yeah.
then that sort of kind of brings me to my last question, my last question um, is about the law. Like, again, as you said, making sure we have proper provenance and everything. That's an industry kind of thing.
Mhm.
But for individual people, you know, before they sell it, or if they're just owning it, I mean, are there laws on the books that require them to turn these items in if they find them?
It
Or is
depends
there an
on
effort?
what items we're talking about. If we're talking about weapons, if it's just a pistol or a rifle, then absolutely not. That's completely okay to own in the United States. Um, you Even body parts, there's actually, oddly enough, no laws governing that. I've seen there's stores that can actually sell human remains, um, which would probably come as a shock to some people, and I was shocked when I found it as well. There's When it comes to fine art and sculptures, there were laws on the book, but now a lot of them have expired. And even in Germany, there was a case about 6 to 8 years ago where a man who was the son of a Nazi art collector, he died and without an heir, and his apartment was found to be containing thousands of works of rare art, and was not legally obligated to return them to the rightful owners. He ended up donating his will, ended up donating them to a museum. Now, what they do with them, that's up to them. But oddly enough, the law is not as uniform and just as we might think that it would be in that respect. Yeah.
Okay. Looks like this might be our last question from the comments, and it says, you mentioned high-ranking and rear echelon soldiers
Mhm.
seeking trophies.
Yep.
Did they seek items that would or could be used to overstate the nature of their service, for example, combat or frontline service?
Yes, absolutely. That was absolutely the case where rear echelon soldiers, and I've seen letters and documents to this effect, where they would send something home to their parents and say, don't tell anyone. I just bought it from somebody, but I'm going to tell them that I killed someone to get it, or did something like this. Officers, because especially those who might have been farther back from the service, they made a lot more money than just a private first class, on the front lines, and so they could purchase these items from on the black market, or from soldiers. Sailors, who on ships, they would trade and barter things, like ice cream or cokes, or other desirable food items to soldiers for souvenirs, whether it was samurai sword or otherwise. And this souvenir hunting practice went up to the very top of the American military hierarchy. There's anecdotes of George Patton in German homes, eyeing the silk drapes, and he's like, and he rips them up and to send home to his wife to maybe make pillows out of, or a dress, or so on and so forth. And so there was really no limits. And even Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific Theater, he received samurai swords and Japanese binoculars and pistols as gifts from lower ranking officers as signs of respect or gratitude, or just as kind tokens. And so these souvenirs become not only stores of memory, but also ways to like kind of indicate respect and other cement other social or formal ties. So it's actually a really they were everywhere. There was no one who was really immune to this. As I said, with entertainers, war correspondents, they all took souvenirs. Congressional representatives who visited the battlefronts overseas, they would get souvenirs if they could, or just maybe as gifts. And so anyone who had the ability to get one, and yet it also was some of them were able to cause concern and outrage at home at the same time. So there's really a double standard a lot of times.
This has been quite the fascinating topic.
I'm so glad you think so. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bamford, and thank you to our audience for listening. We will take a 5-minute break and then return for our Scholars Spotlight, where we'll learn a little bit more about Dr. Bamford and his research. If you are unable to stay for the Scholar Spotlight, our next presentation will begin at 12:30 Central Standard Time, and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Thank you to those of you who have joined us for the Scholar Spotlight and who have stuck with us. We really appreciate it. So, Tyler, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for
So
having me.
this portion of the program, we just ask you a few questions. I just ask you a few questions to get to know you a little bit and to get to know a little bit more about your research. Okay. So the first question is to tell me what drew you to your topic.
I think like many people that I hope will have personal experiences with the topic. I did as well. Some of when I was growing up, I saw some of the objects that my own family members had brought home from the war, like the pocket New Testament that my great grandfather brought back from World War I, or the bayonet that my great uncle brought back as a souvenir and gave to his much younger brother, my grandfather. And so I started thinking about these things, and seeing, in museums, most of their collections are things that were brought back and purposefully saved by individuals. And how they later made their way to museums is, a different story. But the meaning that is attached to these objects, and how we tell stories about the wars, they're all inextricably linked. And so I wanted to kind of explore this when I saw that there were very few articles and no books about the topic. There's one or two books about trench art from World War I, which is a very also fascinating aspect of that war's souvenirs. But with World War II, it's just such a massive conflict, and souvenirs show up in soldiers' letters so frequently. It's really they're really not hard to find. And even in their memoirs written 50 years later, soldiers will still write about an object that had significance to them. And if they had it stolen from them, they'll write about still how they're bitter about it. And so you think about the staying power and the meaning of an object for it to have that kind of resonance, that they still include it 50 years later. It's still one of the things that sticks in their mind.
Well, we love hearing that you couldn't find any other research about it, because we are emerging scholarship or emerging scholars and new scholarship. So we love hearing that. So the next question, if you could tell us a little bit about your research methods or your process, we would appreciate that.
So this project is the what I hope to be my second book. My first research project was about the American and British armies in World War I and World War II, and the relationships between the wars, and that's actually going to be published as a book this summer with the University Press of Kansas. And in doing that project, I was able to read a lot of official documents, and also memoirs and letter collections by soldiers. And so this project, which had been on the back burner for all those years, has now accumulated a critical mass of different perspectives from soldiers of every background. Not just men, also women, soldiers of every ethnic background, and their different experiences with these souvenirs. And so my first, as I'm thinking through all of this material, which is substantial, is that I start with smaller aspects of it, like the correspondence and what was their relationship with souvenirs, or the regulations. And then, hopefully I hope to build on that and create, a much larger work down the road.
Thank you. And what has been your biggest challenge with studying and researching this topic?
I think the biggest challenge is when if you know that something is true, but you need documents to prove it. I have strong suspicions about how these items were viewed when they got into soldiers' homes, but that is actually finding letters where people on the home front wrote to soldiers overseas about the souvenirs they sent home. Those are almost impossible to find, because soldiers couldn't save paper if they lived out in the elements on the front lines, or it just became the letters became too heavy if there were too many of them. And so getting that perspective, looking for the perspective of individuals who are not your typical soldiers, but like marginalized groups within the military or within American society, for instance, Japanese Americans or African Americans is really an important thing that I'm trying to do, and it's worth the work to uncover a broad range of voices, because you want to make sure that the book doesn't speak about just 100 soldiers' letters, but you're really trying to capture a snapshot of an entire army of millions of people. And so it's tough to generalize about so many people's experiences and say something significant, but that's the challenge, and but what is also exciting about doing history.
What surprised you most about this topic?
The aspect where things were taken from concentration camps, that was extremely surprising to me. The ability of soldiers to send home aircraft machine guns, also surprising and confusing. The story where the soldiers sent home a Jeep, that was also just a hilarious anecdote when I discovered it, and it reminded me of a very old Johnny Cash song where he's sending home a worker at an automobile factory is trying to carry out a car in his lunchbox one part at a time. And that's just when I saw that, I was like, I wonder if this was the inspiration for Johnny Cash. Because it was probably a pretty funny news story in the day, in the newspapers. These were things. This would have been something that was very commonly known to people living in the 1940s, and so kind of rescuing it, rehabilitating it, and packaging it and explaining it to those of us who live in an era where war trophies are much less common, although not unheard of. I've been, interviewing soldiers from the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to hear their stories about souvenirs too are really satisfying and enjoyable. And to hear them, how they were influenced by the souvenirs of World War II, also added just one more dimension to the project that I'm really excited to share with everyone.
I wondered if you had done that, if you were continuing to move forward with different wars.
I am. My next project, I plan to focus on World War II, but you can't help but look like, is there a predecessor? Or did this continue later on? The all volunteer force since 1973 has much stricter regulations about war trophies. I will say that.
Yeah, I must say probably the most surprising thing from your presentation are the big, large items that people tried to ship home. Like that just doesn't even sound right to me. But apparently it made sense to them.
They tried, yeah, and some of them might have succeeded, but yeah, just the audacity and the ambition, that it's like, I could really use a Jeep after the war, maybe to drive around the farm. So I'm gonna just try and ship one home. What's the worst that could happen? And I think that question right there, why not? Because if you're a frontline soldier, it's like Ernie Pyle said, is if you're told to murder people every day or try to, is stealing something really that bad? And so the souvenirs also say something about morality and the norms of what it's like to be in combat, and what this can do to soldiers. These were not bad people. You use the word loot or steal, and it has very negative connotations, but they didn't see it that way. The vast majority of them. There were some, even soldiers who wrote in their letters, like, everyone's obsessed with souvenirs, but not me. Then 2 letters later, they'll say, oh, I'm just sending you home some stuff I picked up. It's like, well, you're doing the exact same thing. You just said. So you're not out there to have a gotcha or catch someone in a lie, but it's really funny to see that. And it kind of just proves the point.
Well, what is next up for Dr. Bamford?
Through my work with the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C., I'm in the final stages of editing the wartime letters of Admiral Chester Nimitz to his wife. And so that will come out as a U.S. government publication either later this year or next year. So I'm really excited to talk about that. And just and as we come up on the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, that's been very satisfying work. And then also, after my book comes out this summer, start writing this book about souvenirs. So I'm very excited to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation, for your submission, for taking the time to talk to us afterward. Really appreciate it. And it was a great presentation.
It's been my pleasure, Joy. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you all for joining us, and we will be back at 12:30. So we hope to see you then. Have a great morning and a great day.